Hello everybody, welcome to the Wonky Angle, where I talk about electronic music, both new and old. And today, finally, I'm talking about the new album from Squarepusher, Dostrotime. Man, has it been a minute since I've talked about Squarepusher. I did a full discography review on this guy way back in 2018. I've done full in-depth reviews on all of his previous albums, along with a video counting down my 10 favorite tracks of his, and a video ranking all his albums out at the time from worst to best. Link to the playlist of all those videos is in the description. That might be my earliest discography review that I can watch back on without cringing or thinking, oh, I could do way better than this now. Though I haven't watched a lot of those videos in a long time, so whatever. In any case, for those people who either haven't seen any of those old videos or haven't already suspected based on my taste in the kinds of music I talk about on this channel, Squarepusher is one of my favorite artists of all time. Out of the four big IDM legends that everyone knows, Aphex Twin, Autechre, Squarepusher, and Boards of Canada, Squarepusher is my personal favorite. This guy grabbed me early on when I was in college with his albums that were exploring a unique mix of hyper-frantic drum and bass and crazy breakbeat workouts with Herbie Hancock-adjacent jazz fusion stylings, aided by some of the most insane bass guitar playing you've ever heard in your life. Albums like Hard Normal Daddy and Feed Me Weird Things quickly became all-time favorites and are still pretty universally well-loved to this day. The fact that he put out classics like these at all could automatically put him into the A-list for all of electronic music for many people. But what makes him such a big all-time personal favorite was the fact that he just kept at it and changing up his style with every new album, finding new strengths and creative ideas that could all have their own separate appeals apart from the classics. Delving into pure Miles Davis on the corner style experimental jazz with Music is Rotted One Note and Budokan Mindphone. Really leaning far into the breakbeat workouts on an album like Go Plastic, which basically became the blueprint for the whole breakcore genre, which artists like Venetian Snares would come around to build upon in a bigger way. An album like Ultra Visitor showed some of the most impressive live performances I've ever seen and still had plenty of solid new classic tunes to boot. He started to incorporate poppier melodies on Hello Everything, or modern EDM influences on Eufabulum, or bizarre pop and rock and jazz and prog influences on Just a Souvenir. I may have my issues with this album's production, but there just do not exist any other albums that sound like it, and I would not want to live in a universe where something so damn weird like this did not exist. This guy's catalog is so diverse and deep with so much incredible material with so many different core appeals, and he's made sure to never make the exact same album twice. Which is also why his last album from 2020, Be Up a Hello, was actually a particular letdown for me at the time. Most fans absolutely loved that album, saw it as something of a return to form, with him going back to just focusing on that straightforward classic breakbeat and acid style that he pioneered in the 90s. And even I'll admit the album has grown on me a little in retrospect, just since the sequencing and pacing and production is pretty strong across the board, and that's not something you can always consistently count on Squarepusher to deliver. I definitely see why it resonated for the sects of his fan base who found all his wilder genre experimentations to be more frustrating or hit and miss, and did more to distract from his core appeal for them. Even I'm not gonna say that every experiment he's gone on has been completely successful. But as someone who looked up to Squarepusher specifically because of his constant risk-taking and pushing the envelope for himself, Be Up a Hello struck me as a disappointment for being the first time he made an album that entirely played it safe all the way through, and didn't incorporate any new ideas he hadn't already tried before. At the time, I called it his least creative project yet. Even the album he came out with before that, Damagin Furies in 2015, that may have just been kind of a mix of the styles he explored on his old albums, Gold Plastic and Eufabulum. But those are two very different albums, and mixing their styles and execution still made for something that could more easily stand apart in his catalog. Be Up a Hello just felt like a pure throwback, and didn't really add anything new to the conversation, which old tracks of his like Tomorrow World or Planetarium didn't already. And while the tunes were good, I wouldn't say any of them exactly stood among the best he's ever done. So now it's been 4 years since that album came out, and the time in between has been really quiet. He had a companion Lamental EP to add on to Be Up a Hello, and his debut Feed Me Weird Things finally saw a full remastered reissue on Warp after being unavailable on the usual streaming services for so many years. But aside from that, complete radio silence. which kind of let that initial disappointment of his last album fester for a while and leave me wondering what the future for his work could be like. After all these decades, had he finally run out of creative energy? Was it time to move on? Maybe stick to his brother CFAX, who was quite frankly putting out way better work around that time and you should still also be listening to anyway? I don't know, but I at least kept in mind that Be Up a Hello was just one album. Having one letdown is still nothing compared to, say, Aphex Twin putting out nothing but letdowns for nearly a full decade now. I'll still take Be Up a Hello over the likes of Cheetah or Collapse any day. Squarepusher was still in the place where he could easily bounce back, and based on the creative streak he'd kept up for so many decades before that, I was still always going to be interested in what he would be doing next regardless. I was definitely a little worried when he dropped the lead single for this album, Wendorlan. While it predictably went hard as fuck and hit you with all the crazy acid and drum and bass sound you'd expect from him, it also reminded me a lot of the track Speed Crank from his last album. Once again, it was nothing I hadn't already heard from him plenty of times before. Really had my fingers crossed that this album would not just be Up a Hello Round 2, but wasn't really sure what to expect. So, when the album finally dropped, I braced myself, I jumped into Dostrotime, and I hit the play button, only to be met with a solo guitar piece in Arkteon 1, which kind of reminded me of similar moments on Ultra Visitor, such as Andre or Every Day I Love. Still showing his usual impressive playing chops coming through as strong as ever, but applied to a piece that's way more stripped back and light and pretty. That wasn't what I expected to hear when I hit play. Are we maybe going to get something that brings back some of the old jazz influences that we haven't heard in his main albums like these since the end of the 2000s? Well, not quite. These three Arkteon guitar interludes are the jazziest things you're going to get in this album, and the rest of the album is once again closer to the stuff he was doing on Be Up a Hello than it is to anything from Ultra Visitor. Also, once again, I feel like pretty much all the ideas that showed up on this album remind me of other things he's done before. But just leaving it at that also doesn't really do Dostrotime justice, since what really struck me about this album is how widely varied the sound of this project really is. Like, parts of it remind me of Be Up a Hello, but there are parts of this album that remind me of Just a Souvenir as well. There are parts that remind me of Hello Everything, and Feed Me Weird Things, and Selection 16, and Hard Normal Daddy. It's taking from all sorts of different eras of his sound, almost kind of like his equivalent to what, like, I don't know, The Orb did with No Sounds Are Out of Bounds or something. And there's no single track on here with the ability to boil down the experience of what you're actually getting through the full album. Going through each of these tracks, it's exceedingly rare to get a Squarepusher album that doesn't start out with its best foot forward, so after that Arkteon 1 piece, which is, in my opinion, the strongest and most emotionally resonant of said interludes, we get the real opener, Enbounce, which almost kind of feels like a modern reboot of his old track Tundra from his debut. Like, there's all these spooky Mellotron chords creating a particularly lonely and icy effect, but eventually builds into something much bigger with more buzzing bass lines and bright, flashy, Eufabulum-esque lead melodies with the percussion building up higher and higher like drum rolls. He's throwing in some sick guitar solos both on the acoustic side and the electric side. It feels like it just keeps rising and rising before reaching a softer exhale point at the end. Amazing start to the project, possibly even my favorite track on the album. But what might be more surprising is that he's able to keep up that quality pretty evenly throughout the whole project. Wendorlan may have initially just felt like a safe, crowd-pleasing pick for the lead single, but it's definitely grown on me as I've gotten to hear it in full context of the album, and realized that the other tracks on the album don't really sound like it. I think I've come around on this enough to say that I think I like it better than Speed Crank from his last album, which I initially compared it to. The acid breakdowns, the crashing percussion, revving and blaring rave synths going up next to a few airy and unnerving pads that sound like a tornado alarm going off in the distance. The way it progresses through so many different sounds and keeps you guessing where it might zip to next over the course of those 6 minutes, it's just such a fun ride and can even be surprisingly a little catchy in spite of its lack of a strong lead tune. Possibly the album's heaviest and most visceral banger as well. Now, if you were clamoring for more of a go-plasticky breakbeat workout, the following track, Dune Ray, will do you just well. Just chopping up lots of standard amen breaks over some particularly menacing and heavy bass growling underneath, alongside some other atmospheric effects coming and going. Also a definite banger, and sure to be another easy fan pleaser. I initially marked it as my least favorite here on first listen just because it stuck the most to the sound I went into this album already expecting to get, but with enough repeat listens it definitely won me over more and more. Now, after such big and heavy bangers like these, it's time for something a bit more stripped back and atmospheric in Kronmec, which builds itself around a steady pattern of 16th note hi-hats and some much sparser and slow drum machine percussion tapping away on top of a particularly melancholic and emotional blend of mellotron pads that fade in and out like waves, next to more acid bass lines that do more to add to the track's tunefulness. I do really like the use of mellotron on this album, even if he's using it in a way that feels very familiar. I'm not sure if it's an instrumental texture I've heard him use before, at least not quite in this obvious a way. After the next Arkteon guitar interlude, which is apparently notable for focusing on more of like a microtonal approach, I guess, I don't know, we cross over into the second half of the album and reach Holorform, which was apparently the oldest track included in this collection and based on a guitar demo he recorded back in 2018. This track starts out sounding like it's going to be another more sentimental and stripped back moment as we get into more light mellotron pads that he continues to deliver some guitar soloing on top, but the track quickly picks up into something much more frantic with more crazy drum machine workouts and rapidly buzzing bass and acid wobbling going up next to all his guitar soloing, which I guess has more of an 80s-ish texture to it than any other track here. What with the guitar part having been written first and what the track was built around, it's always the element that feels the most in focus at any given point. Though then we hit the next track, Akkranen, which is another particularly interesting moment for the album. There's a lot more live percussion on this one, with a lot of strange reverb processing effects that give the whole track a lot more of a dub feel to it. Probably the closest any track on this album comes to capturing some of the sounds explored on an album of his like Music Is Rotted One Note. Although it's still not that close, with all of the other unnerving, airy rave stabs and pads and occasional breakbeat chops eventually paying off into a big reverb-soaked acid breakdown at the end, giving the whole track much more of that classic 90s flavor. In either case, it's definitely one of the darker and more foreboding-sounding moments for this project, and there's a lot of cool sounds here that aren't explored in the same way on any other track here, so yeah, that's definitely a highlight. And if you wanted something a bit more comparatively lighthearted, we got the following track, Stromcor, which primarily just builds itself around his bass shredding. Just him going ham on the bass and the guitar next to more fast-paced drum machines and squelching acid textures, and later some other 90s rave stabs and ambient pads in the background. Probably the track here that reminds me the most of the approach he explored on an album like Just a Souvenir, but obviously with much cleaner production and no overbearing distortion on the guitars. And then we hit Dome Lash, which kind of feels like a mashup of elements from the previous two tracks. The percussion workouts are just as frantic and intense as everything else here, and there's plenty of spooky ambience to surround it. Although this track doesn't really have something special to note about it in greater context, it kind of feels like the album's equivalent to what Mekrev Bass did on Be Up a Hello. Even if it's not the longest track, it weirdly feels like the longest track, like it was trying to be this one last late period epic for the album. And also similar to Mekrev Bass, this one did shrink on me a bit with repeat listens. At this point, I think I would probably mark this track as my least favorite for just standing out the least. Although, again, if a track like this is technically the lowest point, I think that speaks to the surprising consistency of quality on display throughout this album. It still goes plenty hard and feels satisfying in the moment. And that brings us to the album's ending. Penultimate track and functional album closer, Heliobat, is a purely ambient piece that just focuses on a set of particularly warm and enveloping pads, much like those heard on Detroit People Mover from the last album, building into some extremely sparse reverb-covered percussion taps that kind of remind me of some moments on that last Music album, and finally bringing in some warmer guitar performances to join alongside the ambience and give the track that much more emotional resonance. Really gets at the heartstrings in a way that isn't matched by any other track here and is another very big highlight for me. Although while Heliobat functionally feels like the album's closer, the real closer is Arkteon 3, the longest and quietest of these solo guitar pieces, and the one, I guess, technically most built to feel like a real track instead of an interlude, although it still feels more like a bit of an afterthought and like an epilogue in the greater context of the whole album. I mean, I'm more than happy that these Arkteon tracks are here for the sake of adding more variety and making the album feel that much deeper. I would not want any of them removed. Although I guess I could say they do feel a little disconnected from everything else on the project, and this last one does feel like the least necessary for the album sequencing. It's like you're just getting an emotional breather after an emotional breather, but it is what it is. That's just kind of nitpicking there. But yeah, that's everything on Dostrotime. Really solid album for sure. I liked it a lot. Sure, everything on this album feels like familiar territory for him, but where that familiarity may have felt like something that sold his true talents short on an album like Be Up a Hello, here it feels like, you know, just getting a look back at everything Squarepusher has ever been about. Bringing together like his whole history through all its ups and downs and weird left turns, but getting all of it to feel like it naturally belongs together. I wouldn't say there's a single track that's likely to go down in history as one of my biggest favorites from him ever. Enbounce and Heliobat would probably come the closest, and the latter might even beat out Tamib Help Bus as my new favorite of his regular old traditional ambient pieces. Though, you know, that's still nowhere close to being an emotional gut punch on the level of Iambic 5 poetry, and Enbounce isn't on an opener on the level of something like Store Eyeglass either. But even with all of that said, like, this is one of the extremely rare Squarepusher albums where I feel like I enjoyed every track on here roughly the same amount. Even my absolute favorite albums from this guy have moments that I like way more than others. Feed Me Weird Things and Hard Normal Daddy may be classics with tons of great tracks, but both albums' first two tracks very obviously outclass everything else that comes afterwards. I think the only other album in his catalog that has such a comparably small distance between my favorite and least favorite moments might be Eufabulum. And even that one still has its moments like 4001 and Dark Steering, which are all the easier for me to remember than the likes of, I don't know, The Metallurgist. Where this album I still have roughly equally as vivid a picture in my mind of what any given one of these tracks sounds like. So Dostrotime might have the honor of his most consistent album yet. At least right now, with it so fresh in my mind. Maybe we'll have to see if that holds over time. As for where I'd put it in my old ranking, it's admittedly kinda tough. I know I like this more than the similarly stylistically scattershot Selection 16. Boy, is that some alliteration. That album felt like it was mixing the acid bangers and the jazzy cuts more haphazardly and putting them next to each other without really getting them to mesh well together. While Dostrotime, as much variety in sounds that it explores, still all feels like it comes together more naturally as a complete whole. I also know I don't like this album as much as just a souvenir, since even if this album aimed to directly improve upon a bunch of the ideas that one first set into motion by, you know, like giving them better production, I don't know, that album just felt so much wilder and more creative and unique, a lot more of like a boundary-pushing left hook for him at the time, which felt that much more like a special moment for him in comparison, where this one still feels pretty safe by his standards. I guess my personal enjoyment is on par with Budokan Mind Phone. Like, I do have a softer spot for that project's instrumental palette and jazzier approaches, alongside that also obviously having my favorite individual track from him ever, despite that track being such a non-indicative opener to the point of openly hurting the album. Dostrotime feels like a lot more of a well-realized proper album statement for him, where Budokan Mind Phone is like a scattered collection of B-sides that didn't make the cut for music as rotted one note. I think I would lean a bit more towards ranking this one above it, but I could go back and forth. So there we go. Dostrotime is yet another very solid effort from Squarepusher that exemplifies all the things about him that made me a fan in the first place. Maybe not sitting among his absolute best, but I would definitely say this is his strongest album since Eufabulum. And if you've somehow not heard it yet, then definitely make sure to give it a shot. I will let this off with a 7.7 out of 10. But of course, this is just my opinion. You can feel free to disagree with it, but I'd like to hear your thoughts, so leave the comments in the comment thing down there. Shout out to my Patreon supporters, they're awesome people. You want to add yourself to that list, link to my Patreon is in the description. But yeah, that's pretty much it. That's all for today. See you next time.